One thing that can be absolutely frustrating among Magic players is the fact that you don't get the right lands or enough lands to cast your spells. If you encounter this problem and your opponent seems to be playing spells on curve, your opponent is going to, well, simply outpace you, considering they'll be able to play cards while you'll just be sitting in the corner watching them play Magic. However, there are actually some decks that one playing against that you can actually get this feeling even if you do curve out correctly. One of these decks is the Tron deck that is actually quite popular in Modern. Not that Tron. Thank you. Playing against this matchup may make you feel like your deck is kind of at a bit of a disadvantage, just because you're playing against a deck that throws out spells that cost 6 or more mana roughly by turn 3. Supposedly, the deck gets its name for the synergy that occurs when you have the 3 Urza lands out on the battlefield. Urza's Mine, Urza's Tower, and Urza's Power Plant. While there are several variations of Tron in Modern, one thing to note is that they all function very similar due to the fact that they run the 3 Urza lands. In short, the most important ground rule you'll have to know when facing this deck is you're going to be on roughly a 3-turn clock before shit is going to start hitting the fan. As stated before, Tron is actually very devious because it does feel like you will be behind most of the time if they successfully manage to assemble all their Tron pieces. This is where it can get really frustrating, as it will feel like your opponent is light years ahead of you while they have a big permanent like Karn Liberated while you just sit there with 2 lands. Gah! Although this is a good rule to keep in mind, you also have to note that they will not always get the access to 7 mana on turn 3. This is why they use several cards like Expedition Map or Sylvan Scrying to get the lands that they need. The point is, you're not going to have a lot of time to develop, so playing a slow deck like a control deck, or even a combo deck that takes a while to assemble, can be a pretty bad matchup. Aggro decks aren't too bad, but you have to keep in mind that the Tron deck does like to run Wormcoil Engine, and that could be a really big roadblock. On top of that, they run similarities to decks like Scapeshift, which run stuff like Fire Spout. Now, the glaring weakness of the Tron deck is that all the spells that actually win at the game cost over 6 mana. Makes sense that the biggest thing that can impact a Tron's gameplay is land destruction. Personally, the best spell I've found in against this matchup is Crumble to the Dust. You just want to drop it on a Tron land. The truth about Crumble to Dust, although it will make the deck have a really hard time casting their spells, the thing is that the spell does cost 4 mana, so you may or may not be able to get it before shit starts hitting the fan, but if you do, it's going to make it quite a bit easier for you. But don't count yourself out, because if you're not running a fast deck or something that can win moderately fast, there's a very good chance that they can still drop something like Wormcoil Engine or Karn. It will just be a few turns later. Granted, you don't have to use Crumble to Dust. Like I say, Crumble to Dust is a 4-mana spell. You can also use things that cost less. Oddly enough, I think Spreading Seas work quite well unless you're playing against Blue Tron, but even so, it does mean that they have to fetch another Tron land or to replace the one that you use the Spreading Seas on. To really give yourself a tempo boost, try using a creature that destroys the land as well. Tron decks are actually known for playing very few lands, and this can be good because if you do play a lot of land destruction, it can make it harder for them to actually gain those lands back. But at the same time, it's good for them because having such a low land count means that they're likely to draw something more exciting. It's also important to note that Tron has lost a bit of power due to Eye of Ugin getting banned. In its place, they run Sanctum of Ugin, which is kind of a one-time effect to fetch a permanent that is ultimately really, really powerful. This isn't quite as busted, you could say, as Eye of Ugin because, like I say, it's only one time, but it's still something to watch out for. To land destruction, another thing that really, really hurts Tron is negating activated abilities. So many of their cards early on have activated abilities, so you can use something like Pithing Needle. Suppression Field is really good as well. But anything that stops abilities early is usually really good because they usually rely on Karn Liberated Expedition Maps to fetch them their lands. And there's some pretty good stuff that you can use. I wouldn't get too carried away with it because the biggest things in the deck do not have any abilities whatsoever, so don't get too carried away with it. If you play blue, you can obviously try a counter spell to counter like the big juicy spells like Karn or Wormcoil Engine. But keep in mind some of the bigger spells like the Eldrazi's like Ulamog or Emrakul, counterspells don't really do anything against them, mainly because they either can't be countered or they'll still gain effects upon casting. It's also important to note that if you have certain spells in your deck that target a CMC specific cost like Spell Snare or Inquisition of Kozilek, those spells usually aren't as good as you think they are, because so many of the spells in that deck that win the game and really matter are much, much higher. So if you run any spells like that in your main deck, it's usually best to take them out when it comes to sideboarding. Considering the most common creature early game for Tron is likely going to be Wormcoil Engine, you should run lots of spells that exile, like Path to Exile is probably the best for this scenario. Something like Anguish of Making I feel is actually really good in this matchup, just because your life total isn't going to matter all that much, and it'll get rid of damn near anything that they produce. If you play Mill, this is probably going to be one of your worst matchups. I'm sorry. Just if you know you play against Tron, don't bring your Mill deck. It's not going to end very well unless you have extra surgical extractions. That may be the only way you can really effectively win, unless the Tron deck is not running something like Emrakul or one of the original Eldrazi Titans. So be sure to bring those along if you want to even have a remote chance of winning. You could also run Relic of Progenitus in response to the Emrakul trigger, and that way you will basically prevent it from getting back into the library. So now that you know what to do, and you know you play against Tron at your local game store or wherever you play Magic, feel free to follow these strategies, and if you play your cards right, you will slay this beast. I hope this video has been some help to you. Tron is a very intense matchup, but defeating it is a very rewarding feeling. If you are having trouble defeating a deck at your local game store or sanctioned event or wherever you play Magic, feel free to let me know about it in the comment section below, and I will be happy to make you an episode about how to beat that deck. My name is Rio Spectre, and I'll see you next time.